Hello, AP Macro students. I'm Mr. Sanabria, and today we're going to be learning all about the third economic measure, and that is inflation and price level as measured by CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So this is a kind of a big topic. We've already talked a lot about inflation, and today what we're really going to do is get to the bottom of how exactly we measure inflation. And we're actually going to begin to talk about inflation, not by saying inflation, but actually we're going to switch to using the term changes in price level. And the reason for that is because the price level change is going to end up being a more useful way of thinking about this for reasons that we'll see here shortly. So the way this is going to go is we're first going to talk about inflation specifically, and basically what it is, the different types of inflation that you could see, the different causes of inflation. We're going to talk about what exactly is so bad about it, and why we don't like inflation. And then we're going to actually shift our focus to measuring inflation and the mechanism by which we actually measure changes in price level. So that's where we're going. It's kind of a lot today, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Let me get myself out of the way first. There we go. So let's define inflation right now. Inflation is defined as a rise in overall price level. See, there's that term, price level. Now, right now, let's go ahead and understand why we want to talk about price level instead of just inflation. And this is the reason. Inflation is defined as a rise in overall price level. But the actual economic indicator is changes in price level. And price level can actually go down. So if price level were to decrease but stay above zero, that's called disinflation. And if price level were to go below zero, that's called deflation. And we talked about this before when we talked about the business model, or the business cycle. And so it's more useful for us to talk about price level when what we're trying to do is relate to the business cycle than to just talk about inflation. Inflation is only a rise in price level. But we would have to then use different terms to describe when price level drops. Or we can just talk about changes in price level. And that's the reason why we're shifting our verbiage now to thinking about price level, because we want to be flexible enough to recognize an increase and a decrease in price level. Okay? The inflation rate is the percentage of inflation against some base year. Okay? And this term base year is one we're going to use a lot today. And a base year could be any random year that anyone, that economists decide. Really, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is who measures changes in price level. Now, the base year is often several years ago. So you might see inflation percentage against the base year that's 4, 5, 6 years on from the base year. Or you could look at inflation rates from the year before, and that's called year over year. So I might look at the rate of inflation from last year. In that case, I'm treating the previous year as base year. But the point is this. Last year, or whatever base year we're using, is just simply the whole, right? Anytime you're doing a percentage, you're talking about some part of a whole. So if last year is just normal base year prices, how much have prices gone up from that base year in terms of a percentage? So let's talk about the types of inflation. Right now, we've got the first type, which is demand pull inflation. And we don't know the aggregate model of the economy quite yet. That's actually what's coming up next. But what you'll notice when we do learn that model is that this is actually kind of descriptive in terms of relating it to aggregate supply and demand. Okay, what we're going to see here is that increased demand is pulling up price level. But for now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because I haven't taught you that model, right? I don't want you to keep that in the back of your mind. But demand pull inflation occurs when people are demanding more and more goods and services. Well, if people are demanding more and more goods and services, well, then you already know regular supply and demand, right? And aggregate supply and demand is going to work similarly. More and more stuff's getting demanded, so the price of things is going up. Pretty simple relationship. Okay? Consumers might just want more goods and services. Now we're talking about different reasons for demand pull inflation. So this is considered good. This is the kind of inflation we actually want to see. I've mentioned a few times that the Federal Reserve Bank targets 2% inflation. Well, that 2% inflation, if it's demand pull inflation, that's kind of what we're looking at. We're kind of keeping the gas pedal on in the economy. What we're wanting is enough demand to spur on economic growth, right? We want businesses to feel like there's enough demand to invest in more capital production, which will eventually grow the economy, hiring more people, et cetera, et cetera. That little bit of demand pull inflation is good. We don't want it to get out of control, though. Now, excessive spending by consumers who expect future inflation, this starts to become not as good. This is anticipating prices going up and saying, well, if prices are going to go up in the future, I better buy now. And it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I think inflation is going to happen. I think price level is going to increase. And so I better buy now while prices are still low. Well, that increases demand. And if that happens across the economy as a whole, well, then you end up causing that inflation that you were anticipating before. And that's obviously less good. And then there's the bad. Overemployment and wage inflation due to excessive growth. That's bad. That's whenever the job market becomes so competitive from the business and hiring perspective that people start getting these pay wage increases that aren't necessarily warranted. And ultimately, people are actually just getting overpaid. And if you're getting overpaid, you've got a lot more money to spend. You're going to spend more money. That puts more pressure on prices. They go up, and then people demand more wages. Spirals upward. This is hyperinflation due to overemployment. Some of the bubble economies, like the dot-com bubble in the 90s, experienced this sort of inflation where wages just got out of control. People make way too much money, drive up the prices of stuff. Now, there's the other kind of inflation. That was demand pull. That's demand side of the economy. Cost push inflation is when something about the supply of goods changes. Okay? And cuts in supply due to things like a natural disaster, these are known as supply shocks. And a supply shock is typically a negative thing, right? We want to talk about negative supply shocks. All of a sudden, a hurricane comes in and knocks out most of the oil refineries. Well, now we've got this big supply shock in this thing, refined oil, which has implications on all sectors of the economy. This is a macroeconomic problem, right? That would be a negative supply shock. Well, if there's not as much stuff, you already know supply and demand, right? If there's less supply, price goes up. And that's the relationship we're seeing here. Okay, and again, cost push inflation. This is actually very descriptive when we talk about the aggregate model, which we're going to do here soon. The supply in the economy, aggregate supply is what we'll call that, decreases. It pushes price level up the demand curve. But we're going to go ahead and hold off on thinking about the aggregate model. Notice I'm starting to mention this aggregate model. It's going to be a very important model for us coming up next. So I'm starting to kind of prime you a little bit, use a little bit of that language. There are political disasters that can lead to a negative supply shock. Just look at, anytime we boycott the goods from some country, what happened in the 1970s? OPEC decided to stop exporting oil to the United States. There was the big oil shortage, and that caused a lot of inflation in the 1970s. And then there's this natural reduction in resources, okay? So if we start bumping up against the problem of scarcity with certain resources, and we actually find that they're now in short supply, well, it's going to drive the price of those resources up, driving price level up. Okay? And then there's this idea of political inflation, and this is the one that you knew about coming into this course from your history classes, and this cautionary tale that we've seen play out so many times where a government tries to print its way out of debt, right? This idea of, hey, let's just turn on the printing press, print a bunch more money, and then we'll have more money. It seems so tempting, right? But what we know is that money is not a resource. You can't pretend like just because you have money, you've actually increased your production possibilities. It doesn't work that way. You're just causing inflation. And as well as we feel like we know this lesson from history, you continue to see countries pursue these kind of policies that really amount to political inflation. So why is inflation so bad? Well, I've got a long list for you. One is that consumption of goods and services is reduced, and that decreases consumption spending. Hey, that's a big deal, right? Remember SIGX. This is all about GDP and GDP growth. And C, in SIGX, consumption spending is 70% of GDP. So, here in the United States. So if consumption spending is reduced, that's a huge blow to GDP, and you start to see recessionary pressures. Okay? Why is consumption spending reduced? Well, things cost more. So if things cost more, then, well, we start buying less. People's savings start losing value, and especially retirement accounts, okay? So it really hurts people who are saving up money for the future. Why? Because the value of the dollar is going down. Domestic inflation, so inflation here, reduces foreign investors who would invest in the United States. So people in other countries say, hey, I don't want anything to do with that currency. That currency is losing value. Why would I convert my euros into dollars if the dollar is losing value? It's not a safe place to put my money. So foreign investment is reduced. People who are on a fixed income are hurt. And these are people who are usually retired, and they're receiving some sort of pension payment that may have a cost of living allowance that increases with inflation, or may not. And if they don't get a cost of living allowance, then that amount of money that they're getting, maybe it's $4,000 a month, which seems, hey, that's really good. Over the course of time, if inflation occurs, $4,000 doesn't buy you nearly as much as it did when you first started receiving that pension. So fixed income recipients, they definitely get hurt by this. Lending is reduced. So banks, and we're going to learn a lot more about this in the future, so I won't get too into it, but banks, you know, they want to know what the level of inflation is going to be. They need a predictable, stable rate of inflation so that they can understand the time value of money, meaning how much is the value of money going to drop over time. Because that's where they want to start when thinking about how much interest to charge. Okay, so hopefully that made sense, right? If there's going to be 2% inflation, well, we need to start off this loan by saying, hey, you're going to pay me 2% annual interest just to keep up with inflation. And then if I want to profit, I'm going to add some more interest to that. Okay, and that's actually called the real interest rate. But if it's a period of hyperinflation, it's unpredictable, we don't know where things are going, or we know that the inflation rate's going to go up, we're not going to lend, or if we do lend, we're going to require very high interest rates because we need that buffer zone. We don't want this loan to be unprofitable. Now you have long-term investments, which they're hurt because it's the same principle as your savings losing value. Now we're getting into kind of second and third order effects, right? You start to have labor conflicts because employees are demanding wage increases, but what we got to also think about is at the same time, business costs have gone up. So business costs go up at the same time as cost of living goes up. Everybody who is an employee wants a raise to afford all this the new expensive stuff because the value of the dollar's gone down, but employers are feeling the pinch because all of their input costs have gone up. And so you get these really irreconcilable kind of labor conflicts. Then panic buying might set in, where people just buy. This was kind of what we saw before, causes of inflation, of expectation of future price level increase may lead to a lot of buying now. Well, if people just say, all right, I'm going to start hoarding stuff, well, that's going to make problems really bad. And then finally, capital flight, where people who do have wealth in the United States are seeing that wealth diminish. They're seeing the value of the dollar go down, and eventually enough is enough. I've got to get my money out of this economy. I've got to get my money somewhere converted into another currency that's more stable, where price level's not going up, where it's not losing value. Okay? So there's a list of the negatives of inflation. But who does it help? It does help somebody. It helps everyone who's already in debt. If you already owe money, the amount of money that you owe is worth less and less. So now that we've talked about what inflation is, being an increase in overall price level, And we've talked about why it's bad, and we mentioned, that it does help people who are already in debt. Let's talk about now kind of the meat of what today's about, which is measuring price level. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, the first way is that we want to come up with the CPI, okay, the Consumer Price Index. This is an important term, and you need to know what it is. It is the measure of overall cost of goods and service bought by a typical consumer. It is a measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer, okay? That's what it aims to do. It aims to measure the cost of a basket of goods, all right? And we'll look at what this basket of goods is here in a second. But who's coming up with these numbers? It's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay? And they put out the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, every month. And I've got a link to their website on the web page here. So if you have any time, it is worth going to check it out, especially if you really like data, because there's all sorts of economic data on the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, website. Now, here's the deal with Consumer Price Index. It is the main index that's used to measure changes in price level. It's the primary way of doing it. There are other indexes, or indices, however you would like to say it, that measure change in price level, okay? But the one we're most concerned with is CPI. All right, so let's look at this basket of goods real quick. Well, here it is again. Just saying that it is used to monitor changes in the cost of a basket of goods over time. What this means, this idea of changing the cost of a basket of goods, it's not literally a basket, but it's this never changing list of things that is reflective of a typical urban consumer. Okay, and if we bought the same thing every single month, how would the cost of that basket change, right? The same stuff, the same quantities, every month we bought the same thing. How would it change in price over time? Maybe in 1950 it would have only cost $100 for this basket, but now here in 2016, when I'm filming this video, the basket that might have cost $100 in 1950 would cost $1,000. And I have no idea if that is accurate. Probably not. But that's just an example, right? So the cost of this basket of goods goes up over time. Okay? How do you calculate this price level? I'll put myself right there. This is how. Okay? And I have a little, price level change equations cheat sheet posted on the website, and that's really useful, and there's some good notes on there and these equations, but let's talk through them real quick. Okay, when you're making a calculation about price level, there's two potential calculations that you might have to make. Okay, first you may have to calculate the CPI, and that's generally your first step to anything. You need to know the CPI, so unless you're given CPI, you have to understand how to calculate it. And the simple way to put that is the new prices divided by the old prices. Okay, so new prices over old prices. And then you end up with some sort of a decimal, and you multiply that by 100, which is just to move the decimal place over 2 spaces. And it gives you a whole number, and that's CPI. Now, the important thing to understand about CPI is that it's the Consumer Price Index. It is an index number. And what that means is it's off of a base. And the base of CPI is 100. And what that means is the base year CPI is 100. Always. It's always 100. And if you think about the equation, that makes sense, because this year's prices, or new prices, in my equation that I have right here, this year's prices over the base year prices would be the same thing over the same thing, which equals 1 times 100 equals 100. So what we really want to say is, okay, how much is the basket of goods in 2010 versus what much was the basket of goods in the base year, 2008? Then you're going to end up with a different number times 100, and it might be something like 108. Well, if it's 108, if CPI is 108, then there was an 8% increase in price level. Okay? The other thing you might have to do is calculate the rate of inflation. And the rate of inflation is calculated by using CPI from the years that you're concerned with. So you need to know the CPIs. Okay? The calculation for the rate of inflation is the change in CPI. So that is the new CPI, like the current year CPI, or the year you want to find the inflation rate for, minus the old CPI. So maybe you're looking for inflation from base year several years ago. You would subtract those two CPIs. Or maybe you just want to know the year-over-year inflation rate. In that case, you'd put this year CPI minus last year's CPI. And you put that, which is, it'll give you the change in CPI, and you divide that by the old CPI, the base year or previous year, whatever you're doing. That's going to give you a decimal. You multiply that by 100, and it's going to give you a percentage. Notice that this is not an index. This is a percentage rate. So you're going to end up with a percentage of inflation over here on inflation, whereas with the CPI, you end up with some number that's usually 100 and something. And don't worry if those explanations didn't make a whole lot of sense to you, because I'm going to go ahead and work out a couple of these with you on the whiteboard, and that's where we're really going to, I think, understand how this works. Okay. I got a note on the bottom here. You use economic data, current prices, to calculate CPI, and you use CPI to calculate the rate of inflation. Hang on to that, okay? So to calculate inflation, you need CPI. You need economic data to determine the CPI. Now, before we go and do some practice on calculations, let's finish up just talking about CPI in more of a general way. And here's a criticism of CPI, and that is that it doesn't measure the cost of living. And that's not necessarily a critique so much as people want it to be a measure of the cost of living, but that's simply not what it is. It's an accurate measure of certain goods that make up the typical bundle, but it's not a measure of cost of living. It's the measure of price change over time of certain goods and services. Now, those certain goods and services are reflective of the typical urban consumer, but that is a different statement than saying that this is a measure of the cost of living. Now, here are some actual problems with CPI. From an economic standpoint and from, that question its usefulness as a measure of change in price level. The first is this idea of a substitution bias. The basket doesn't reflect consumers' reaction to price change, which means that if the price of beef goes up, and beef's what's in the basket of goods, and consumers just react to that by buying more chicken instead, the CPI measured the change in the price of beef, but it didn't capture people's actual spending habits. Okay? And in order to do that, we would need to do something called a changed CPI. And a changed CPI is possibly what we'll be going to in the future, because it would take that into consideration. Now, why would it be important to consider the actual spending of consumers when all we're really trying to do is measure price level change over time? And the reason for this is because of those cost of living allowances that I talked about briefly before. Let's say that you're receiving Social Security checks, and you do get a cost of living allowance, and that cost of living is increased by the amount of inflation, and the amount of inflation is measured by CPI. Well, if we're not considering that people actually don't buy the now more expensive beef, but they actually buy chicken instead, what we're really doing is using CPI to overestimate people's cost of living. And if cost of living is what we're trying to actually maintain through the cost of living allowance, then you end up giving people too big of an increase. Okay? The other thing CPI doesn't capture is the introduction of new goods. Okay? Some new goods require fewer dollars to maintain the same standard of living. All right? More efficient appliances. Stuff like that. That's not going to get captured. And it doesn't measure quality changes. Just think, a car is more expensive now than it used to be, but how much do you get with a car? Satellite radio, navigation, the little camera that helps you back up and not hit anybody, steering and brakes that are just really advanced. Some cars will brake themselves. There's all of these things, the safety features that, yeah, they're more expensive, but they're also incredibly, they're more productive. They give you so much more for your money, and that doesn't necessarily get captured by measuring CPI. Now, what we want to do here at the very end of the slideshow is talk about a different measure of price level, and that's the GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator is actually a different measure of price level change over time. And the only thing that's different about it is that it gives you a more broad picture of the price level change. So we take everything that was actually considered in GDP and we apply the price level change to all of those things. And then we end up with the GDP deflator. So the equation for the GDP deflator, if you want to know it, is nominal GDP over real GDP. Multiply that by 100 and you get the GDP deflator. Again, it's an index number. To get real GDP, and we talked about real GDP before, but I didn't give you the equation because I wanted to wait till now when we were doing these price level changes and applying them, is nominal GDP divided by the CPI. So whatever the CPI is for a given year, divide nominal GDP. Okay? Nominal GDP over CPI times 100 will give you real GDP. You can use real GDP in this equation to get the GDP deflator. And again, these two equations are on the price level formulas cheat sheet that's on the website. So that's everything for the slides. And I know that was a lot, and it seems like, oh my goodness, there's all kinds of equations going on here. And there kind of is, right? But we're going to go ahead now and we're going to work through a couple and you're going to see it's not very scary.